623. This is a commentary from Western Journal. And I don't know, this is the second one I've done today, but I like them. So, this says, the Biden-Harris ticket's goal of equity is illogical, discriminatory, and totalitarian. That's what caught my eye, so I thought, why not? Today's left is utterly opposed to equality of opportunity and equality under the law. Instead, its policies pursue the goal of equity, also known as equality of outcomes. Seeking out such a goal is not only undesirable, it is also immoral, because the only way to attain equal outcomes among diverse cultural groups is through totalitarian means. Democratic presidential candidate Joe Biden and his running mate, Senator Kamala Harris of California, aim to enact equity policies across the U.S. if they are elected. So there's a big difference between equality and equity, Harris said. Equality suggests often everybody should get the same thing, as opposed to equity, which is everyone should end up in the same place. And if you then understand not everybody started out in the same place, you understand some people need more, end quote. Harris' analogy is based on the assumption that all groups have the same demographics and cultural norms. That idea is demonstrably false. Because different groups act differently, finding total equity among all groups is virtually impossible. No person in his or her right mind would argue that the Asian, Black, Hispanic, and white communities in America are culturally homogenous. Subsets of those communities aren't even homogenous with one another. The groups have varied cultural norms, traditions, and attitudes. The differences don't stop there. In 2018, the median age for white people in America was 44, whereas the median age of U.S. Hispanics was 30, and the median age of Black Americans was 34, according to a Pew Research analysis of Census Bureau data. Obviously, the 44-year-olds are better wage earners than people 30 and 34. They've been in the workforce much longer, have likely received more raises due to time on the job, and have more work experience. A huge part of the racial and economic divide then can be attributed to age differences among these groups. A man is not even equal to himself from different points of his own life. Even if you removed age as a factor, there remain huge cultural differences between racial and ethnic groups that inevitably lead to more differences in outcome. It isn't only racial group outcomes that leftists want to equalize. According to them, men and women should be equally represented in all occupations, and they should be equally compensated as well. That's what the whole gender pay gap argument is about, after all. However, as with racial and ethnic groups, the measure of outcomes between the sexes doesn't take into account other factors. Women and men make different choices in education, occupation, and hours worked. When you account for these variables, along with a few others, the gap shrinks to nearly 0%, proving discrimination is not a primary driver of inequality in this case. Nevertheless, most people on the left blame the gap on sexism. A popular, widely spread left-wing meme illustrates the left's argument for equity perfectly. It is incredibly misleading. Two identical kids standing on a ladder is not an honest... Okay, I'll have to describe this to you. All right, so it's two kids. All right, two kids, identical kids standing on identical ladders. Between them, there is what I presume to be an apple tree. The apple tree is bent more towards one of the children who's standing on top of the ladder and is picking apples, while the other child standing on top of his ladder, their ladder, whichever, because the tree is bent away from him, is not able to pick any apples, and he has this look of exasperation on his face. That's the two children and the apple and the tree they're talking about. It's incredibly misleading. Two identical kids standing on a ladder is not an honest comparison. Although minorities who grow up in poverty do have some inherent disadvantages, as does any community born into poverty, although poverty caused by welfare incentivization disproportionately affects minorities. Their racial identity is not even close to the important factor. The graphic fails to account for numerous group differences, which is also a failure of Democrats and most left-wing equity policies. In a more accurate illustration, sometimes one kid wouldn't even try to reach for the apple, the difference of choices. Or maybe it's not one kid, but one adult and one kid, mirroring the age differences between the groups. The adult can reach the apple because he's older and taller, and not because the other party has fewer systemic advantages. In any example, teaching the disadvantaged kid to climb the tree or build a ladder would help that kid become more independent. Giving him a ladder every time makes him dependent on whoever is giving him that ladder. He'll never learn how to do things for himself. This is exactly how equity policies work in the real world. Affirmative action, for example, gives extra advantages to some groups over others, although in the end such policies have been shown to hurt the very people they purport to help by, for example, placing minorities into schools for which they aren't academically prepared. Entrance exams were made to determine whether the student is ready for the coursework or that he or she will face when going to a school. Whereas minorities are set to succeed if placed into a school based on their scores, if you artificially inflate their scores simply because of the color of their skin, those students will be and have been put into more rigorous schools for which they are prepared. This creates higher dropout rates and lower grades overall, as reported by The Atlantic. Another example of equity gone wrong is the 2008 housing crisis. Because of equity policies, lenders were pressured into lending to minority communities more often, even if the constituents of those communities were unable to pay back their loans. In the end, neither of these policies actually helped, they only exacerbated the problem. Jordan Peterson, a renowned clinical psychologist and University of Toronto professor known for his stand against radical leftism, explained the faults of equity quite thoroughly in an essay on his website. The emphasis on diversity, for example, is in a direct logical contradiction to the dogma of equity. The two simply cannot coexist. If people are in fact diverse for whatever reasons, and according to the collectivists, primarily for reasons of race, ethnicity, sexuality, and sex, then they bring distinctly and important different talents and abilities to the table in precise proportion to their diversity, Peterson wrote. The inevitable consequence of encouraging that diversity and giving it free play in the world will thus be an exacerbation of inequality rather than its elimination. If equity were the goal, then diversity would have to be done away with. By such elimination of differences, such elimination of differences is by definition an elimination of diversity, although the latter is apparently laudable, as it is, when the diversity is based on difference of opinion rather than difference of immutable physical characteristics, and vital to the proper functioning of social and political organizations at all levels, he wrote. Furthermore, Peterson pointed out that far-left communist totalitarian regimes throughout world history have enacted equity policies. They have never worked. Quote, "We know the left can go too far. The Soviets taught us that. The Maoists and the Khmer Rouge taught us that. The North Koreans and the Cubans and the Venezuelans continue to teach us in the same manner. We don't know exactly when and where the going too far begins, but I'm willing to stake my claim on the equity doctrine," he wrote. In a word, it's inexcusable both morally and practically, and should be regarded, in my estimation, as an ideological position that should be roundly rejected by anyone who wishes to be taken seriously in any reasonable political discussion. And we should well remember that reasonable political discussion is the only alternative we have to outright strife and the kind of conflict that tends to degenerate rapidly and dangerously. These regimes eventually did create equitable outcomes for the majority of their citizens. Everyone had the same number of crumbs to eat as they died of starvation, and everyone was equally likely to be executed for treasonous capitalist oppression if they kept too much money for themselves for reasons such as feeding their families. If Americans don't want their country to end up like this, they must reject the far-left Marxian goal of equal outcomes. If taken to its logical conclusion, it can only end in utter oppression, totalitarianism, and a massive death toll. This is submitted to or by the Western Journal. That was pretty good. All right, 623 out.